My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. On today's episode, I talked to Alex Teplitz, who goes by either Aldermancy or Sword Ghost, depending on the platform. We had a very wonderful conversation, and we talked about player agency, player choice, world building with the characters in mind, narrative control tools, and mirroring. We also touch on the stream Alex is running called Strange Hungers. Don't forget, if you are interested in being on the show, hop on over to our Discord server or ping me on Twitter. And without further ado, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Alex, also known as Aldermancy on many social networking platforms. Alex, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am about to graduate college, and I've spent the past about 4.5 years just getting more and more immersed in the tabletop role-playing scene. I'm actually a member of a college role-playing group that was started by Keith Eberon, interestingly enough. It's called the Discordians at the college that I go to. And they do a bunch of weekly games. They run D&D campaigns. We have Magic the Gathering tournaments, that kind of thing. That is the main group that I've spent a lot of time GMing for, DMing for, planning events for. But the most fun story I think I have related to getting into TTRPGs is that my first year seminar, which is a mandatory class for freshmen at my college, was actually called the Dire Cast. And it was a classical medieval studies course that focused on game design as a method to look at classical history. And it was run by this really, really amazing professor. His name is Hamish Cameron. He's actually an RPG designer as well. He designed the Sprawl, which is very, very fun. Lovely game, and I highly recommend it. And he was very passionate about introducing us to a world of indie RPGs. I think, again, like this is about 4 or 5 years ago at this point, before I had any inkling of any kind of indie RPG scene, as it's been booming in recent years. So it was really fun. We played things like Fiasco. We played some games that he had designed. We looked at interesting like warfare and wargaming history and some of the history coming up of D&D and other role-playing games, how they come out of strategy. So that was really fun. It was super amazing. I met a lot of friends in that class, and then I also got to connect to a few other professors that he was friends with. So I've actually played and run D&D games for a bunch of academics, which is a very fun experience. I think they bring a lot to the table, and it's brought me together with people of a bunch of different ages, from a bunch of different backgrounds. So, yeah.
That's really cool that you kind of got introduced to it in a college class, and that sounds the way you describe the college class. It sounds like one that I wish I would have gotten to have when I was in school.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I am such a big fan of it. And I do think that there's such a space in academia for using gaming, for gamifying experiences and education. I have a bunch of friends who are looking at using role-playing games in psychology work, in education work, in getting reluctant learners to engage in storytelling. So I happen to think that there should be more classes out there that just include interactive storytelling as a way for people to learn and engage and to bring up topics that people might be less interested in, historical gaming, but also ideas of, I don't know, like safety as well, in gaming, and using games as a way to approach maybe difficult topics that are hard to learn about or talk about, by allowing people to have empathy by stepping into roles instead of talking about them for a more, like maybe intimate, personal experience.
Yeah, I always wish that there was a little bit more in terms of, like you mentioned, gamifying learning. I know that there have been a few games that I have played that has expanded my knowledge of just various things, like the Civilization franchise, right? I got into that.
Absolutely.
I got into that when I was younger, and then would be reading up on all these random little like historical locations and different military units from different time periods and stuff. And it's a lot more interesting when you're engaging in it from a perspective where you care about the information than like you need to know this because it's going to be on the test.
Absolutely. I think games are such a fun vehicle for becoming part of a story instead of just learning about it in, a dusty textbook. And I've had I actually took another game design class. More recently, I think this was about year and a half ago, and this was digital game design. This wasn't tabletop role playing as much necessarily. But we also got to look at some of that like really cool history of where gaming comes from and how it was used as sort of in tandem with some like political power structures or people who were very involved in coding and programming, or even in like governmental, bureaucracy kind of thing, as a way to decompress, as a way to relax, but also to take some of the very intense topics that they were dealing with and to find joy and delight in them.
You mentioned that when you got introduced to kind of the tabletop space, that it was more the indie scene. What games did you start out with?
Yeah. I think one of the first games that I ever played was Fiasco, which is super super fond of Fiasco. It has it plays on a lot of tropes of like heist or spy kind of movies. It really leans into that space. And it has a very different kind of like building of character. Talking about people like with ambition and poor impulse control. It's very like cinematic. It's capers. It's things going disastrously wrong, messing up their reputations, and often ending in some kind of not very fun ending. But I think it's very beginner friendly. It's very easy to learn. It only takes about, I'd say, like 2 hours to play, 3 to 5 players, and it also comes with 3 different play sets. It's also very genre bending friendly. I would say you can really hybridize a bunch of different genres playing Fiasco. So it's really cool. And I think it's by Bully Pulpit Games. So I definitely recommend checking that one out. And that was a really cool game for us to play as people who hadn't done a lot of RPGs. I don't think anyone in the class that I was taking had ever played a role-playing game before. And learning it through like with a professor who does game design constantly, meant that he was pulling both from sources like movies he was recommending that we should watch, or like classical mythological stories he was recommending that we should read, but also teaching us about the design of a game, asking us how we're being asked to step into character, how we're being asked to step into setting, and how games like Fiasco pull not just from a game design, history, but from a narrative design. What kind of narrative ends up getting told? What kind of endings are you looking towards, even as you're building a character from the very start?
And how has starting with Fiasco, has that kind of informed or kind of molded your DM style?
I I think in part it has. I hmm. I think it was less just playing Fiasco and some of the other indie games we played, and more that I wasn't introduced to GMing and running stories just with D&D, which I know is a wonderful entry point for a lot of different players. But I actually, before I ever played a game of Dungeons and Dragons, I designed a role playing game for the final of that class. And it wasn't a role playing game that was focused necessarily on how, and it was leaning into narrative themes of pulling from free I played meant that I come from a very narrative tradition of storytelling. So always looking at the story you're trying to tell first, and then what mechanics can you shape, can you build, can you work with players to make in order to highlight that story above all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as I've slowly been expanding my kind of horizons of what I've played, I do tend to find myself moving a little bit more towards some of the narrative stuff.
Yeah.
Um, sometimes just for ease of running it as a game master, because there's usually less rules then, but also because it sometimes seems easier to uh, come up with or have those cool like cinematic moments, kind of like you mentioned, leaning into maybe more cinematic tropes than like writing
Yeah.
tropes. Are there any specific like tools that you use narratively to help your game?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm an English major. As I said, I'm about to graduate, and I'm actually working on, interestingly enough, a interactive fiction narrative English major thesis, which is just the coolest experience, and I'm very, very lucky to have it. But it means that anytime that I run games, I'm pulling more from, as I said, a literary tradition. So I like to use tools like the hero's journey when I'm thinking about the kind of story that I want to tell. I like to use things like Freytag and plot and narrative climax and character challenges as I'm thinking about the story beats that I want to hit when I'm writing a game. And the other big thing that I think narrative highlights when you are designing and trying to tell stories is that you really have to start in the action. You have to pull the reader in immediately. And that ties in maybe more towards short stories. I tend to think of short stories as the most like a one shot or a 3 or 4 session kind of game, because short stories there's something my fiction professor always says: short stories begin at the moment when everything changes. You don't need all of the building up. You don't need all of the world building that game masters do, and some games just do. They have all that world building packed into them. A short story starts when everything changes, and we have to look at the aftermath of that. It can be as small as a crack in a relationship. It can be as big as an apocalypse, but you have to look at the aftermath and how characters react to it. You view the story through characters understanding how their world is falling apart in some way. And I think that entering a game session, entering a story, even a longer term campaign story, that's really the moment that you're looking for, is when everything changes in the lives of these characters. For example, we have a very classic, like, you meet in a tavern kind of Dungeons and Dragons narrative, and that's still when everything changes because the group comes together. They're brought together in some way. You're meeting people who are powerful enough or interesting enough or compelling enough that you begin to take a journey together instead of individually. I like to start any kind of game experience or story experience with a very, very tight, concise prompt. I want the story to be what brings the characters in, and then I look to the players to tell me all the rest of it, because any kind of very simple premise that you're planning is going to be entirely shaped by the characters in that story. You could tell there's like 700, 800, a million zombie apocalypse stories out there. And sure, they pull on different tropes, and sure, they use different themes. The zombies are faster, or they're more infectious, or they act in different ways. But the reason we come back to those stories is because we want to know about how different humans face the idea that they're edible, that people are chasing them, that
Right.
their lives have changed in so many ways. So we look again and again and again to a single story because we care about how new characters react to that story. I think the same should be true of any kind of game experience you tell. You come up with a very interesting, compelling story, but you should be able to tell it a million different ways based on what the players bring to the table.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense because a lot of the books and stuff that I have read, or even like TV shows and stuff, the ones that really pull me in and keep my attention are the ones where something happens like pretty much right away.
Hmm.
Um, and you kind of get that little bit of a taste, and then you want more. And I was kind of thinking of like Harry Potter.
Yeah.
um, we don't see like, I mean, there's maybe like a scene that shows when he's a baby, but then it like jumps to, however old he is, and then it's like, bam, okay, now all this weird stuff is starting to happen, and this character who didn't know he had any, didn't know magic was real, all of a sudden is kind of thrust into this weird, situation that is what the world is, and we don't see that in between piece, from when he was growing up, because it really wasn't that important.
No. Yeah, starting in media res, like starting in the midst of plot, it's just a very powerful tool that I highly recommend, especially if you're looking for a tighter or shorter experience. I've run one shots and I've told stories where I'll take like a very concise plot element of like you're going into a crazy dungeon or you're facing off of a big enemy, and then incorporating flashbacks of how the characters got there. But there's something so wonderful about confronting your players with an immediate threat and then letting them determine what brought them up to that point after they know what the threat is. Because then you're building forward-facing characters who can, reflect back on what brought them to that point, but they are built inherently to care about the threat that you're facing. You start in the plot because they immediately have to care about whatever you're putting in front of them.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and it seems kind of like a Powered by the Apocalypse, or like you said, kind of indie thing that I feel like more games are kind of going towards, to say, hey, make sure your players have some buy-in here too. So when you're doing that, you have the main plot element, but then you just say, why is it that you're in this situation? And then just let them answer however they want.
Yeah, exactly. I think I ask anytime that I start a game that I've been very proud of or something that I want to continue, I come up with a significant event, or I come up with a, as you said, a plot element, and then I ask the players, why do you care? Because that's what really brings you to the table. I think I would very much enjoy, sort of a looser open world style. It does appeal to me in the way that you can have so many different elements that players can care about. But I really recommend starting from that moment of why do you care? Because you're not always going to have players who are going to push to connect with other characters. You're not always going to have characters that are going to have a lot in common. But if they all care about that one thing, they always have something to talk about. They always have something that they're thinking about. They always have something that's going to bring them together. And then you can get into this delightful, delicious conflict of, we're very different people, but we have to care about the same thing. Instead of saying we're totally different people, maybe one of us is super religious and one of us is a criminal. We're super, super different. Why would we meet in a tavern and suddenly go out exploring the world together besides, oh, we want to make money? And we want to make money is a perfectly valid and wonderful plot device, but desperation, getting your players to care desperately about a single idea, I don't know. I think it works every time. It always creates wonderful, interesting, not just parties, not just D&D style, but it creates story, because the story tugs them along, and they fill in everything else for you.
So I'm kind of picturing like my players, right, sitting around the table and like saying that to them, and I assume that when you've asked players this, that somebody will say something, and then like the next person says something like, oh, and maybe I'm like your sibling, or I also work for that same organization, and like they kind of build off of each other.
Yeah, so I also find that, and that's why I always try and propose a premise before character work happens. I think, if you let people know a game's happening and they start bringing characters to the table and bringing, backstory in, there's so many ways that you as a game master can build those things together. But there really is a delight in starting with that simple premise, and then, as you said, doing character work together, saying, yes, I want to reflect off of this element that you're bringing to the table, or I want to connect with you in this backstory, or the reason that you care is the exact opposite of the reason that I care, but we met along the way, and we've been figuring out this problem together.
I assume when you're kind of going through this process, you probably don't necessarily encourage your players to have any like backstory pre-planned, right? You're kind of hoping that most of it will come out of like an initial session.
It depends. I think based on the game that I would be running, I might be very, very eager for a player to bring a lot of backstory to the table, to have a lot of ideas ahead of time. The only thing that I am ever concerned about is if character backstory just doesn't tie into the story at all. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't happen, but it does put a lot of energy. It requires a game master to put a lot of energy into taking that backstory and adapting it to the story they want to tell. And there are lots of people who have so much fun with that, who like want to take that backstory and then surprise a player with, this and this NPC or this character or this faction that you face was actually part of this larger grand conspiracy plot. I love that so, so, so much. But I've definitely had players come to me with a very concrete, established character concept that didn't necessarily fit sort of the genre of the story. Meaning that let's see. So I'm running a D&D campaign. It's called Siren's Quell. It's just a home game that I enjoy a lot. But the general concept for that campaign is that all of the players are graduating and becoming members of a secret order of spies and assassins for the Grand Empire of the world. So all of the players, in order to become part of that assassin group, have to have spent time training with the Empire. They have to at least pretend to be loyal to the Empire because they're becoming super, super high-ranking, spies for that Empire. They have to have a reason that they would want that power or want to do missions for that Empire. And a player came to me with a concept that was very original and individual, and it was a character who had a very rich, intense desire for power, but wanted to find a group of people to like be there for Horsemen of the Apocalypse, And I have a hard time saying, well, that is a really lovely character concept, but why the hell would you be working for this empire? You're not from the empire. You don't want the same things as the empire. You're just looking for power. So we had to take the character concept and shift it to explain why this, random like dark wizard would spend 4 years at a college hanging out with college kids and, learning and studying and, playing like fantasy sports games in order to become part of the spy order. So you can take those really strong backstory concepts, but I think it does require a lot of work to fit them into a story versus I brought the same campaign concept to a different player and I said, you have to care about this empire in some reason, even if you might later discover, oh, they're corrupt or, oh, you don't like the empire as much. And this player said to me, I'm going to lean in so, so hard to this concept. I'm going to make a player who is incredibly nationalist, who has been brought up in this empire their entire life, who has nothing but the utmost loyalty, blind devotion to the empire that you've built. And that character has been, in so many ways, the heart of the party because they continually hold other players to a narrative standard of giving a shit about the people that they're working for, which means that every other character can be less loyal. Every other character can have questions. It allows other characters to be suspicious or paranoid or have different desires because there is one character that is so tugged along by the narrative that everyone else follows in their wake.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
When you're going through these, or just like in general, when you're kind of moving along through different story points, do you tend to also like give them kind of various things and then ask them like, okay, this thing happens and then, tell me about it or explain more to kind of give them more little like tendrils into kind of the creation of the world and the story?
Yes. Absolutely. I think that all the world building and plot building I do tends to center character very intensely. I will say I have this, like we've talked about, you have this nugget, you have this idea, you set it in a world where that plot is going to be relevant, but everything else around it gets filled in by character choices. And it really creates this like wonderful self-fulfilling loop that I think we love to see in our fantasy stories. Something I've been thinking a lot about recently is that you are in sort of a classic tabletop role-playing game scenario, especially if you're, being the game master and creating the world. Everything that you everything that you make should mirror, reflect, and highlight the characters who are part of the story. If I was writing a novel, for example, and I really wanted to highlight some of the difficult experiences that the protagonist had gone through, I would write the novel to highlight that. There could be a random car accident that reminds them of an event in their past. The car accident happens on a meta level specifically because it's going to make the character feel something, and then you can write about what the character feels. There's so much world building that you can do by yourself that doesn't become story until someone else cares about it. And the best way to get people to care about story is to just ask them, what do you want to see? What is important to your character? So if I have a player say, oh, I really liked, that detail. I really like this element of world building. I really like this political power or this blacksmith shop. Saying yes is the most powerful thing you can do because they've told you that they care. So suddenly, because they care, the element they care about means everything. I've had plenty of funny experiences of a player, picking up a random detail that I didn't intend to be that important, a throwaway joke that you don't expect people to actually, think of as super plot relevant, but then when you take the things that they highlight and you bring them back around and you bring that symbolism back in, or you have a random NPC keep appearing just because they get so excited when they see that NPC, what you're actually telling them is that they're in a hall of mirrors and that everything in the world is going to reflect an element of character back to them.
That's a really neat way to think about it. And it's something that I hadn't necessarily considered. I think it's something you try to do kind of subconsciously, maybe
Mm.
as a DM, to try and when there are things that they like to let them experience those things more. But I guess I just like the way that you phrased it, in that you should be trying to reflect and mirror those things back to your players.
Yeah.
Do you ever run into issues with player choice or maybe giving them too much choice?
Ooh, that is a wonderful question. I personally haven't had as much issue with it, but it's for a very specific reason, and I think it's about the foundation that you build before you ever even start a game. If you tell players that you care about their choices, if you say, your agency is everything to me, I want you to be able to shape this story with the choices that you make. You are setting an expectation for them. You're telling them that, even minor details could become really, really significant. And the place where that could get dangerous is if you have a lot of expectations for your players, if you want them to be constantly engaged and if you tell them that there's going to be crazy, crazy consequences for every single action that they have. Uh, they have to know that. Otherwise, you run into problems maybe of accessibility, expecting everyone to have their brains super active all the time and be paying attention all the time. Or if you just keep punishing them and threatening them with consequences that you didn't actually warn them about, that's when you do run into trouble of taking choices too seriously. I also think that you can have trouble with players who will take advantage of that kind of agency, but that comes down more to the way that you set up a group of people, like the people that you look for when you're telling these stories, and recognizing that there will be some players who want to set the world on fire. If you are not prepared with a world made of kindling for a player to set on fire, when you have that kind of player, then you have to let them know about that from the get-go. You have to give them that concept from the very beginning of saying, there will be consequences with certain actions that you're going to take. Not every game of any RPG, not every game of D&D is set up to deal with those consequences. There are plenty of wonderful, silly games that you can play where consequences don't matter, and there are plenty of games that are set up, to have all the ducks in a row and let players just shoot them down willy-nilly. But I think it's more the idea of agency and choice and caring a lot about it. That ties into safety in so many interesting ways. Not letting players take advantage of a story you're telling, but if you think about the story as something that is tightly held in your grasp and they're trying to wrestle it away from you, then you're always going to end up with issues of players making choices you don't expect, because in this crazy wonderful hobby of storytelling, any story changes when you bring someone else into it to tell it with you. You are always going to find ideas you don't expect. It's the sense of willingness to adapt to things you don't expect that creates atmospheres where players just have a lot of respect for the decisions that they make. Doesn't mean they have to take themselves super seriously, but it does mean that they start to care, about the character. They start to care about the world because they know that it's built for them in some way, or it's built because of choices that they've made. And I've never seen player care as something that is dangerous. It has only ever been wonderful in my experience.
Well, that's good. That's encouraging. I feel like for people maybe who haven't played some of the indie games where it talks about more of this like player choice and kind of offloading world information or lore to be decided by the players. I think
Yeah.
the one thing that people get nervous about if they've never seen that is like I don't want them to just like completely go off of the rails,
Mm-hmm.
with it. But I like what you said, where you're coming from. Like if you're giving them these things to care about, and you're just open, kind of about how the group is going to be and how the world building and stuff is going to be. For the most part, you haven't run into issues. And I guess the other thing I would add is that as the game master, you still do kind of have the final stamp of approval
Yeah.
if somebody
Yeah.
goes off the deep end. But it I think that may be a challenge for some dungeon masters is to relinquish a little bit of control there.
Oh, absolutely. I think my advice for those dungeon masters in particular, and just my biggest piece of advice generally in relationships, just, relationship where people are building things together, is that communication is the most useful tool you can have. I think there's so much wonder in a DM who takes exquisite care to build a world and to build a plot and to have, a narrative that they care about, to create a set of beautiful rails for the players to follow. And there can be a danger of players hopping in and saying, well, I really like this other thing you mentioned. It is entirely in a different direction. And then use a dungeon master saying, well, I want you to play a game you like. And if that's something that you like, oh, maybe I'll delete my whole plot to go follow it. But communication, if you communicate to players that you have built something for them, even if it's not at the very start of a game, even if you just say, okay, I understand that there's this other trail that you desperately want to follow. If you just tell your players that I have built something wonderful and interesting in a direction that I'm hinting you should follow, hopefully that lets players know that there's something fun in that as well. You have to that they think of the dungeon master as a player or an interested party as well. There's nothing better that you can do as a dungeon master when you are flustered, frustrated, struggling in a moment, than to just speak up and say it to your players. There's no angry god, manifesting over a world of terrified people. Your players shouldn't be your pawns. If you let your players know that you are fallible, if you let your players know that you are working just as hard as they are on creating a beautiful experience together, if you let them know that you don't know what to do next, that you are not sure how to react to a decision that they've made, or that a decision that they've made has been painful or difficult or might cause some hurt feelings. Saying it up front is the best way to move forward.
Couple pieces of advice that I think one of them was from Matt Colville.
Yeah.
I think he kind of talked in one video about like the players had like a choice where they could keep going into like further into like a dungeon, or they could just like turn around and go do something completely different. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things he said was like, well, I've prepped the dungeon, so we can either play what I have prepared for, or if you don't want to do that, it's going to be next week before we can actually do the other thing that
Exactly.
you want to do, because I just don't have anything planned yet. So, and either is fine, but just being upfront with your players of, I don't think I can come up with something on the fly right now. So, like, this is kind of what we have. And then I think one of the other things, if it's just like a little quick decision or a quick thing that you're maybe not sure how to react to, I have seen people say to like, okay, let's just everybody take like a 5 minute break, grab some snacks, use the bathroom, and just like give the DM some time to just like process what's happening so that they can make a good, narrative decision versus just coming up with like the first thing, that maybe is less satisfying, but it's the first thing that they think of. I know
Yeah.
as a DM, it can be hard to want uh, to say like I don't know what the correct answer is for what happens next. So it's hard to sometimes say, okay, yes, we need to take a break and I need to just think for 10 minutes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both of those pieces of advice. One of the things I would add on is that there's a bunch of very cool safety tools that are out there in regards to narrative flow that a dungeon master can use, besides just saying, I want to take a break. One of the ones that I've seen that I really enjoy is the idea of a play, pause, and stop button for moments of roleplay, and the ability to rewind. I've played with game masters and I've seen game masters who really want to play, like, hold players accountable in the moment to every decision that they make. They let a secret slip out, even if a player was like, I really didn't mean to do that, or they pull a weapon and it has crazy terrible consequences and they didn't mean for that to happen, and suddenly their character like is dead. Having a pause and a rewind button, being able to say in a moment of a game, I need to pause and think about what just happened, or I would like to rewind. I would like to take another look at, the decisions we've just made and what brought us to this point. Because you're not just watching like a $1 million budget movie where things that are difficult to watch just happen because they've been established. It's an ongoing, living, breathing story. And if you use that like safety tool format of saying, we're kind of constructing a piece of media together, it's okay to pause the story and react like from secondhand embarrassment, or react because you just saw a jump scare in a movie and you want your breath to calm down. You want to like catch your breath. It constructs the experience as something that you guys are stepping into and that you can step away from without ruining the actual piece of media. It's always going to exist for you to come back to.
I really like the rewind, pause, stop. And when you mentioned like a big budget movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that came to my mind was they don't shoot those movies in. It's not the first take that you see on
Yeah,
every
yeah,
single
yeah.
scene, right? So having to like, okay, let's just rewind a little bit. Maybe something else makes a little bit more sense. Let's revisit that. Because you're right, we're not even in the movies that we watch, you're watching the final cut. You're watching the
Mm-hmm.
best scenes that made the most sense in terms of the narrative. But that's not just what was filmed. They filmed a lot more than that in order to get those snippets. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting is you mentioned being kind of punishing towards actions. One of the phrases that got used in the last D&D campaign that I was in was "it's been said." So as soon as somebody had said something, even if it's like, "Oh no, wait, it would be better if I did this." Nope, it's been said.
Mm-hmm.
That is what happened, and there was none of that. ability to kind of like tweak things or to relook at things. But just as a DM, I really like the idea of that, basically having a remote control to say, okay, we need to stop here for a second so we can catch our breath and figure out what happens next.
Yeah. And I think they're different styles. That style of wanting to rewind or pause isn't going to work for everyone. There are people who really do want the consequences of it's out there in the world and let's see how people are going to react to it. It just comes down to having communication conversations with people at the beginning of, there might be reflections very immediately of the actions that you take. I just like to suggest the idea of being able to rewind and pause as sort of a method, again, of accessibility. There are plenty of casual RPG players who aren't going to say like the most brilliant thing off the top of their head as soon as you present them with a problem. They're not going to have the perfect reaction. They might make silly decisions, or they might make a joke, or they might make a decision that they really regret. Giving people a chance to rewind, step back, like process or think about the decisions that they want to make also helps with maybe people who struggle with processing disorders or neurodivergence. I myself have ADHD, and I definitely find that there are moments where someone says something to me and I didn't hear it very well, or I'm confronted with a problem and it really takes me some time to think about how I want to respond to it. So that rewind tool can be a nice way for a DM to just say to a player, I'm not expecting you to be perfect immediately. I will let you take time to figure out in your brain, how this story follows your method of decision making.
Right, and just that accessibility and being open with your players, especially when you have intense scenes happening.
Ooh, yeah.
Sometimes it is easy to make quick decisions, or like I said before, like sometimes it's just like I'm not sure. Okay, the first thing that pops into my head, that's what I do, and maybe that's not what your character would do, or maybe that's not the most narratively satisfying thing to do. So
Mhm.
yeah, I like having that as a tool to use. We are getting kind of close to our hour.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you want to talk about before we kind of switch into some of the projects that you're working on?
No, I think that sounds good. A lot of a lot of the ideas of agency and accessibility that I've been talking about come up in a project that I've been working on recently. So I'd love to chat about it.
Perfect. Well, I will just let you lead right into it then.
Cool, absolutely. So the big thing, the very very exciting story that I'm working on right now is actually a streamed game. It streams every Saturday from noon EST to around 3:30 p.m. EST. Sometimes we start a bit earlier, sometimes we start a bit later. This is a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons campaign streaming over on Twitch at Total Party Kiss. You can find us on Twitch or on Twitter, and it's called Strange Hungers. Strange Hungers is a homebrew horror campaign that I've been writing with some friends of mine, and we just got started. It's about 4 or 5 episodes in, and it is absolutely a delight to work on. One of the reasons I've been thinking so much about agency and choice is because I think that horror requires a very specific level of safety from players. I've consumed a bunch of horror movies. I love horror podcasts, all of that stuff. But one of the things about telling a horror story is that it is intense. You have an emotional reaction to certain kinds of horror. You need to have a space to step away from it. You need to know at the end of the day that as terrifying, scary, and monstrous as the world is, that you can retreat from it. I think that's one of the reasons that people like horror. It allows them to process, horrific experiences or to process darkness in a space that doesn't directly touch on their life, that isn't going to have actual physical consequences in their real life. So horror RPGs and horror storytelling allow us to step into the shoes of characters who are going through those experiences to process ideas that might be difficult for us to think about in our day-to-day lives in a space that we can step away from. Strange Hungers is a delightful little game because it doesn't immediately delve into super, super intense horror. The idea we've been talking about of having, this like seed, this plot that the characters get tugged along and tugged into, comes up a lot in Strange Hungers because the concept for the campaign is that the party is playing an expeditionary group that are venturing into horrific frozen wastes on the edge of the world. All of their characters have a reason that they would want to go on this expedition in the first place. They all have that call to adventure, and it can be different for all of those characters. But we didn't really get to that call to adventure in the first moment. I knew it was coming. I proposed the campaign to the players with the idea that they would be going on this expedition, that they needed a reason their characters would be coming together to do it. But they didn't necessarily know the full breadth of the horror they might be facing. They still don't, of course, that would be spoilers in these wastes. But they do know that it is a deadly area. They do know that it is going to hold some kind of monstrosity. So we've built very deliberately characters that are prepared or not prepared to face monstrosity, but also characters that will find themselves reflected in the monstrosity of the world. The things that they face are going to be the things that they fear. The monsters that are going to try and kill them are going to have reasons to kill them. Everything about the chaos of the horror of this world ties deliberately into the things that the characters care about. So we've done all of that prep work ahead of time. We've talked about safety. We've talked about what the players are comfortable with seeing in facing in horror. We've talked about what the player characters are afraid of, and what would specifically scare the shit out of them. So we've done all that. We've done all that work beforehand to say that where you're going. It's going to be terrifying, but you get to take the time beforehand to discover these characters deeply in an area of the world that is less scary. So yeah, it's a great project. I'm super excited to be working on it, and it does reflect a lot of that intention, that agency, that making choices. Even though you're a character in a horror movie, of course you're going to make bad decisions. Everyone from the get-go knows that they're heading into a place that is super devastating and terrifying and scary because it's a horror campaign, but they make those decisions anyway because it fits the story.
I really like just kind of like circling back on both the player agency and kind of the talking about what they're comfortable with and what they're comfortable with seeing, but then also knowing like, okay, here's some things that I'm okay with seeing, but they would also still really freak me out. So you have just the way that you described it just feels like a really solid foundation for everybody's going to feel safe, but everybody's also going to be terrified at the same time as they go deeper and deeper into this world.
Yes, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. There are so many different like flavors of horror. And I think that specifically, I am playing a D&D game. The recent source book, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, touches on some really fun different genres of horror. I highly recommend it for any dungeon master who is looking at running a horror campaign, even if they don't want to use any of the setting elements, because there's a really great section in the Guide to Ravenloft that talks about genres of horror for people who might be more new to it, and it gives you suggestions for monsters or encounters that a player might face in that genre of horror. Things like cosmic horror and aboleth, or things that are more like gothic horror and vampires and skeletons and werewolves and all that stuff. And it's been really, really fun to pull from because it touches on how you can genre bend D&D to fit just so many different kinds of stories. And I've been pulling from Guide to Ravenloft in terms of the possible encounters that I'm going to construct, but I've also done a lot of reflavoring to make them suit the world building that I've been doing, and to make them, horrible and icy and dripping with black oil and monstrous and all that stuff.
Do you have a plan for like how many like episodes or streams that this is going to take, or is this just going to be kind of an ongoing campaign?
This is definitely a longer ongoing campaign. As I said, we've had about 5 or 6 episodes at this point, and the players literally last episode just received the funding for the expedition that they're about to go on. So we have not even dived into the wastes yet. There is a long, rich, wonderful, horrifying plot ahead of them. So it should be ongoing most Saturdays, right now, every Saturday for the foreseeable future.
And do you have, can people go back and watch previous episodes?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find previous episodes both on our YouTube, which is Total Party Kiss, and on our Twitch. We have all of our VODs up on Twitch, Total Party Kiss.
Cool. So anybody who is new to the show can go hurry up and catch up since you've only got a handful of episodes
It is
out
a
there
perfect
so
time
far.
to hop in.
So you said this was a 5th edition game. Have you done any tweaking or anything to the system or the characters or anything for the stream?
So much. So much. Yeah. I personally love homebrew and I do a lot of homebrew and I also pull from a bunch of other RPG systems. I tend to think that any game of D&D is going to be very unique to the table that it's being run at, but I have done I think that each character, yes, every single character that is playing in the game has some element of homebrew, whether it's in their race or in their class or in boons that they've been granted as well. The world itself is also entirely homebrew. There are homebrew schools of magic, there are homebrew languages, there are homebrew mechanics, things that the players roll for every day, or interactions that they have with gods that might be very different from a traditional D&D pantheon.
That's really exciting. I personally really like homebrewing both as a DM and when that's an option for me to come up with stuff as a player. So
Hmm.
um, definitely within my style or preferred style as a RPG enthusiast, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and the very fun thing, again, like all the themes that we've been touching on, the homebrew that I really like to design is homebrew that is intrinsically based both in world building and character. So I often find that the homebrew that I design isn't necessarily specifically balanced to slot into every D&D game. Usually the homebrew that I design will be based on a major element of my world. It might be based on the specific divinities that you can find on that planet. It might be based on certain themes or powers that come up again and again. Specifically in my world, hunger comes up again and again and again as a form of monstrosity. What are people hungry for? What do they desire? That basic instinct and how that can corrupt when you are too hungry. So a lot of the homebrew that I do, I always do it with players. We'll do that sort of reflective process that we've mentioned, which is that they'll tell me something they find interesting. I say, okay, here are 3 or 4 places that you can find that interesting thing in the world, or here are 3 or 4 characters who might have a similar experience to the character that you want. That means that I'm pulling in like heroes, myths, legends that tie into the character, that reflect the character. It means that when I design like subclasses, those subclasses always come from a place in the world, and they're always built to highlight something, an important element of the character, a facet of their personality, or something that is very important to the character. So I think that you don't have to balance homebrew for everyone. You can balance homebrew by giving a player exactly what they want and then also telling them, this homebrew has specific consequences. I really love that system of like, I'll give you a boon and I'll also give you a curse. I'll make this more powerful than a normal subclass might be, but it'll also come with specific consequences because because it's more powerful.
That is a fun way to design things. It
Mhm.
makes everything that you have, whether it's an ability or an item or whatever, you have to think a little bit more carefully about it versus just, oh, this
Yeah.
is just a +1 sword or whatever. It's just an upgrade, right? There
Hmm.
are there are consequences there, and I also really like the idea of homebrewing for the world that you're in, just because it feels like that's going to give players a little bit more buy-in to the world and just then you're using kind of mechanics or items or abilities or whatever to then reinforce the themes or the narrative or the lore of the world that you're playing in. So I think
Oh
that's
yeah.
really cool. And I mean, fifth edition isn't necessarily balanced by itself, anyways. So I mean, who
Yeah.
cares, right?
Exactly. Things are balanced to work with other mechanics. There's plenty of discussions that's been had about PvP and if you place a wizard against a barbarian, who would win. But I definitely agree with you that I think you don't always have to design for balance in a game that has strategic elements. You can design for the balance of your own story. And not every dungeon master necessarily wants to make crazy, crazy powerful monsters and have to upgrade their world to face crazy, crazy powerful characters. But I do think that that give and pull, that tug, that story that you do in homebrew, you will generally find that a player having fun is the best measurement of balance. If a player is having so much fun and totally wrecking you, okay, well maybe it's less balanced, but you still know that they're enjoying it, so you can base, the way you adjust it on that. If a player isn't having fun, isn't getting to use abilities, even if those abilities might be crazy, crazy powerful, even if they could, touch a dragon and knock it down dead, but they're not having fun because they don't see any dragons and they're never using that ability, well, it's balanced in a different direction. It's not narratively balanced, even if it's, mechanically super powerful.
I think that comes a little bit back to your reflection thing that you
Hmm.
mentioned before. One thing that I've tried to do as a game master is when there's a player that's really good at something or has kind of a specific skill set to expose them more to those things. Because I've been a part of games where, like, I played a monk
Hmm.
once, and one of their cool abilities, right, is that they can deflect or they can like catch arrows and stuff, right, in fifth edition.
Yeah.
And so, like, from the enemy's perspective, shooting arrows at the monk is just a waste of time because it's either not going to hit them or do damage, or it's going to do very little, right? And there's a possibility that they throw back at you, which is not good. But it's super fun as a player. But then sometimes in those situations, the DM will be like, "Well, this isn't really effective, so I'm just not going to shoot at the monk because that would be a waste of my turns." Which
Mhm.
then, like, as the player is like, I have this really cool ability and I never get to use it.
It's not
or
fun.
or like having like a martial character that has a bunch of attacks, right? Give them a bunch of minions that they can just kill really quickly with a bunch of attacks. Or even if you have like a tanky character, like throw a bunch of like weak minions at them that will attack a bunch of times, and then like everybody misses because their armor class is so high, right? That's
Yeah.
enjoyable to them because they've built a character that is designed to either be in those situations or play that role in the party to defend or to attack or whatever. But if you never throw stuff at them, or if you are always like, well, last time the enemies didn't do any damage to you, so I'm just going to make them hit harder, then that becomes less fun for the character. That's entire thing is, I just want to be a tank and not take damage, right? So again, reflecting and sometimes throwing stuff at players that from the enemy's perspective is going to be wasteful. That can be a lot of fun for players.
Yeah. And all of that, I completely agree with all of that. I'm always a fan of just, yeah, letting the players use their abilities. But one of the cool, subtle things about like challenging players in a way that they're prepared for is that it actually is also good storytelling. D&D has so many of these like very subtle ways of doing world building just through the classes that are available. You think about monks, and there's an implication that there are people who train for this kind of these martial abilities. You think about paladins, and it implies orders. You think about warlocks, and it implies cosmic entities. So just by those classes existing, it gives people so much to build off of. But when you say, okay, there are people in this world who can literally catch arrows with their hands, why would there be people who can do that if there weren't a shit ton of arrows flying around, right? Like, why would people train up these abilities if there wouldn't be situations where they could use them? Why would there be weaponry that is specifically designed to kill undead if there aren't undead to use them on? So the idea that a mechanic exists specifically so it can be used means that you're doing that same process of creating a world that reflects what the players want back to them. It's not just because it's fun for them. Of course, it is going to be fun for them to get to use whatever they've been working on, but it implies that all the hero work, D&D is about heroes, all the hero work that players do is to become heroic in a world that challenges them in a way that they are prepared for. They do all that training to face horrors. They do all that training to face challenges that exist in this world long enough that people rise to meet those challenges in specific ways.
Yeah, I think that was a really great way of just kind of summarizing that whole piece there.
Yeah.
We are getting about to an hour.
Mhm.
So, is there anything else that you would like to talk about or mention, or maybe talk a little bit about where we can find you one more time before
Yeah,
we are done?
absolutely. Well, that was a lovely conversation. Thank you so, so much. Yeah, I can just talk about myself a little bit. So, yeah, my name is Alex Teplitz. You can find me on Twitter at Alder_Mancy. You can also find some of my game design work. It's going to be more of it's coming out real soon. As I said, I'm working on an interactive fiction thesis that's going to be released as a game, hopefully in 2022. You can find me on itch.io at Sword Ghost. You can also find me on Ko-fi at Sword Ghost and most other places, Twitch, TikTok. I'll just be regular old Aldermancy.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciated having you on. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brock. It was so, so nice to talk to you.